So let's give a hand to Don Letts.
Thank you, thank you.
Now, when I asked Don to join us for our sessions at Bestival, I said, pick 2 albums. One was yesterday, he chose Bob Marley, Catch a Fire. And today, of course, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On, which I believe would be many people's selection for a favorite desert island disc. Why did you choose this album?
Man, why did I choose this album? Should be easy to answer that, shouldn't it? But I've got to give a bit of background to this record. It was the first record I ever bought as such, album. And I'd already been, you know, Marvin Gaye had already captured my young ears with a string of hits through the 60s and everybody else's. And, but nothing prepared us for this. This was a quantum leap in the Motown catalogue. You know, what Motown was about was feel-good music, dancing in the streets. But this was against a backdrop of kind of world turmoil, it has to be said. This record, I believe that a lot of the greatest records are informed by the social, political, cultural climate of the times. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a better example than this record. Those times included, what are we talking about here? The Vietnam War's in progress, you got the Paris riots, you got Kent State, you got the Grosvenor riots. And I think what was interesting about these times, contrary to what our man Gil said, the revolution was being televised. So you had this collective feeling of what the fuck's going on. But in the black mainstream community, no one was vocalizing that. I mean, Dylan was doing it for the white guys. And I guess on the more edgy side of black music, we had people like Last Poets and Gil Scott. But in the mainstream, no one was addressing the kind of global ills of the planet. It was more about escapism, it has to be said. But there was no escaping the shit, because the fallout of a lot of this stuff was actually affecting people back at home as well. There was lots of protests in America against the Vietnam War, a lot of reaction to the way that the Vietnam vets that were returning were being treated. And Marvin's brother was actually a Vietnam vet. And a lot of this record was inspired by stories that Marvin's brother told him. Now, to add to all of this chaos, it has to be said, Marvin was, I think it's fair to say, he was a pretty troubled man, pun intended. Troubled. He's falling out with his wife, Berry Gordy's sister. Berry Gordy owned Motown Records. She was 17 years older than him, you know. Taxman was on his arse. By this time he'd acquired a coke habit. And the thing that really nailed it for him is that his singing partner, the beautiful Tammy Terrell, passed away from a brain tumor in 1970, I believe. And between all these things, it kind of knocked Marvin for 6. And it was ironic, because at that time he was actually having a few hits.
I Heard It Through the Grapevine was massive.
Heard It Through the Grapevine, and...
Well, Ain't No Mountain High Enough with Tammy.
Hold up, just before that, Abraham Martin and John. And I guess these things alluded to what was coming, but nothing prepared us for this. And nothing prepared Motown for it, because this record very nearly never happened. I actually found this out because I was asked to do this event, but I didn't know Marvin didn't even write that particular record. It was conceived by one of the Four Tops, who presented it to the band.
Obie Benson, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. And the band was like, yo man, what is this? This is protest music. We don't do no protest music. And then I think it even flew by Joan Baez.
Did it? Well, I know that Marvin was producing the originals and he wanted to give it to them. And then Barry's sister, his wife, said...
After those two turned it down, they took it to Marvin.
Yeah.
Marvin was going to give it to this band that he was working on called The Originals, who again was having success with. And basically, what's his name, George? The Four Top guy.
I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember. The Four Top dude.
Obie Benson.
Yeah. Basically, he wanted Marvin to sing the song. And Marvin could obviously relate to this thing because it was dealing with it was like a social statement. And it was something that he was aching to do and wasn't allowed to do because of the whole Motown, what was that school? Motown had a kind of, a finishing school where they told them how to dress, how to look, what to say, what topics they could actually address in interviews and things like that. And this was increasingly frustrating for somebody that was being affected by what was going on around him. And this song kind of fixed a lot of those ills. Anyway, Marvin pulls together the Funk Brothers, legendary Motown band. Actually, I think this record is the first record they actually got a credit on. And pulls together this track, What's Going On. Apparently the recording sessions are very different from the normal sort of disciplined Motown sessions. Apparently there's a lot of weed and a lot of alcohol there.
Also, when the session players came in after doing some of their like really high-end session players, jazz players and stuff, and they'd come in to do, after a gig, they'd come in to do a recording. They always thought, oh, the Motown sessions are kind of fun, like quite pop, but this one was like serious, serious music. And when they saw the scores that David Vanderput had arranged, they were like, oh my gosh, this is some serious stuff here.
Anyway, Marvin laid down the track. And a lot of that stuff on the track, I don't know if you know, a lot of that, again, I said yesterday, a lot of the greatest things that happen in music happen by accident. There were a lot of accidents on that record that Marvin perfected. The horn thing that opens up the very opening of the album. I think the sax man came in and was just working out what he was going to play, and then Marvin said, thanks, goodbye. And the guy's like, I'm just working it out. That became the sax intro. When you hear it, you'll get what I mean. It's beautiful. Apparently the bass player would turn up after doing other events, so he'd have to play the bass lying on the floor.
They were late sessions. They were late sessions.
Even things like the multi-tracking of his voice, I believe Marvin, you know, you lay down a couple of vocal takes and then you pick the one you like, and he asked the engineer to play back, you know, vocal tracks 1 and 2, and he played them back together. By accident, Marvin liked that, and he made it into a style of his. Double tracking. A lot of musicians do it, don't like their voice actually do it now.
Also singing close to the microphone was another thing, because he used to project and stand quite far away from the microphone. And on this album, along with the double tracking, he got really close to the microphone, and that became his style after this album. Kind of singing like really close into the mic and then double tracking it.
Anyway, so Marvin, I like this double act. Double checking my facts. Marvin gets the track together. Marvin actually gets the track What's Going On together and presents it to Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy's reaction is, it's the worst thing he's ever heard. It'll ruin your career. This isn't what Motown does. And basically tried to stop the whole project. Unbeknownst to him, I think he was preoccupied with working, I think Diana Ross was blowing up big around that time.
And they're doing the movie out in LA, Lady Sings the Blues.
So Berry's preoccupied with Diana Ross.
In more ways than one. In more ways than one.
That.
Yeah.
I kissed her once.
Did you?
She walked into my shop and I kissed her. Dig this. I'll tell you something embarrassing. Don, let's embarrassing story. I kissed her and then immediately turned around and walked straight into a plate glass window. Luckily, she did not see. I'll tell you another faux pas with a musician later on if I remember. Where was I?
So he's over on the West Coast working with Diana Ross. He said it's the worst thing he's ever heard.
Press up 100,000. Guess what? Record goes to #1 in the soul charts. Berry's has to eat his words and said, okay, we'll release the album if you can deliver it in 30 days. Marvin, if I remember rightly, delivered it in 10 days. When you hear this record, it's fucking amazing, man. I'm telling you, it's such a trip. Needless to say, that record became, I mean, to my mind, it is one of the greatest records ever made. It's publicly, critically acknowledged as such. And I think what's interesting about it, it is really timeless. Listen to what the dude's talking about. All those things are still affecting all of us now. And there's some powerful lyrics in there. Things like, you know, who's willing to die to say, who's it? What? I can't even remember. You'll hear it anyway. But I listened to it just the other day before I did this by way of homework. And it still brought goose pimples to me. I got to say, I cannot tell you how great this record is. I go as far as to say, if you don't feel this record on some level, you ain't got a soul. You might possibly be even dead. That's how much I think this record, I rate this record.
I wanted to also talk about the whole African-American musical thing that was happening first in the 60s with Motown itself. Of course, there was a lot of great R&B coming out and soul coming out, but Motown weren't very politicized as a label. The music that was coming out was much more sweet and still beautiful. It appealed to black audiences in some ways, but it also appealed obviously to white audiences. I mean, I argue the point that just the fact that you had
this probably is not put down, by the way.
Yeah. No, not at all. And I'm about to say why. I'd even argue that actually the whole side of the fact that Berry Gordy, who was an African-American man, owned probably the most significant independent label in the 1960s is a political statement in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then of course Norman Whitfield comes along, and he was pretty political. And when he started working with the Temptations, they started doing some more political things. And then the Four Tops.
I was going to say, it's good that you mentioned that, because that album kind of opened the way for a lot of acts to kind of get into social statement and commentary. You know, Stevie Wonder, even Smokey came with some stuff after that. My soul responding, just my soul responding. And yeah, it opened the floodgates for people to kind of address things that were sort of taboo before.
Exactly, absolutely. I mean, Stevie Wonder actually had to renegotiate his contract after What's Going On came out. And he ended up recording 2 albums at that time, which had some political songs on it. And he ended up getting the exact contract that he wanted. You know, he wrote up his own contract, and he really took a stand, not really per se against Berry Gordy, the owner, but just made his point, like, no, you're not going to command what I'm going to do artistically or even business-wise, which is quite interesting. So Marvin really set a standard for a lot of black musicians, not only at Motown, but at other labels as well. So that was one thing I wanted to talk about. But the whole thing, I think, is very interesting on this album. Even though it's coming from a black man's perspective in America, he never once and quite consciously mentions black in this album.
Because the problems back then were affecting absolutely everybody. Like I said, no one was actually vocalizing it in the black community. You know, and I think that's the beauty of the record, that it's all inclusive. It's not like a black thing, you know.
Of course,
and it's very visual too. I think another thing that struck me when I was listening to it, it's like, you can see the shit happening in your head as well as feel it and hear it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he was like quite conscious of, like, he wanted this to be for everybody. I mean, obviously it's coming from his own personal experience, and it's going to have his own angle on it, obviously, as well. But he wanted it to appeal to everybody. And I think we could say he was pretty successful at that.
I mean, if you've got time, good. I mean, I'm going to look in Wikipedia and have a look at the accolades it's achieved since its release. It's amazing. You know, what we're hearing is a young man finding himself and rebelling. You know, he was rebelling against Motown. I mean, even this look. Before this, have a look at early pictures of Marvin, and he's got like he's the archetypal slick black dude, you know, two-tone suit, short cropped hair. He looked fantastic. This was a reaction against Motown. You know, after this he starts to wear, you know, African dashikis. He even pierced his ear, which was a direct sort of fuck you to Berry.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he grows. He has
sounds like a big deal now, but in those days it was a major deal.
And also the way he was positioned and what he wanted to do in the beginning when he found his voice as a singer was he wanted to be a crooner, like Frank Sinatra, you know, which is quite interesting. So the fact that he was able to kind of break out and he held his ground against Berry Gordy, saying, no, that's the worst thing I ever heard. He's like, well, I'm not going to do anything else.
That's right.
You know, and just standing his ground was quite a powerful, powerful thing to do. And we were talking about this earlier, like how a lot of these classic albums they're born out of frustrations, tragedies, pain.
Yeah.
And this one is definitely a great example of that, you know?
Somebody once told me that nice people don't have great ideas. And I think there's a little bit of truth in that. Because he was definitely, he had a duality throughout his whole life. There's a great book written by David Ritz, I think. What's it called? Divided Soul. And his whole life was a struggle between God and the devil. And it's clearly demonstrated in his music. You know, he does this, and then the next record's all about hedonism and sex. It's Let's Get It On, which is equally brilliant, I have to say, in a much different way. But his whole life he was struggling between these two things.
Yeah, I mean, even Let's Get It On was still very provocative in another way.
Yeah, that's what
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was really interesting.
I mean, he was definitely a tortured soul. I mean, he even had to go to exile to, where is he? He went to Belgium. Do you know about that?
No.
He went to Belgium for like a year, you know, to kind of try and clean up and everything, and just got more of a mess. Anyways,
do you have a favorite song on this album?
You can't separate them, man, because it's a song cycle. The album ends as it begins, and for the most part they seg one song into the other. And all these things like don't sound like a big deal now, but back then it was like mind-blowing. It's like, what? You know, Motown couldn't deal with it. They couldn't see separate singles and other than what's going on. So it's groundbreaking in its production, in, you know, its social and political awareness. I mean, so many ways, man, I can't tell you. Especially within the whole black thing. even though it's not a black record, because it needed somebody to stand up and say, yeah, we can deal with this stuff, we can address it, we can't, you know, it's not all about partying and dancing, because ultimately you can't spend your life on the dance floor. Eventually the music stops and you've got to go out and face reality. And this album helps you do that. Absolutely,
and it's still pertinent today. I mean, with it talks about inflation, environmental degradation, war. I mean, these problems haven't gone away, which is probably why it's still so popular. Any closing comments? I think we should probably get this album on relatively soon.
No, other than if it, like I said, if it doesn't touch you on some level, you got no soul. Go see the doctor.
All right, well, let's have a listen.
Listen, I'm going to warn you guys, it's going to get hot in here because it's sunny outside, but try and hang in there. And if you can't, get this record. Trust me, it won't let you down.
Well, thank you. Hey, why don't you have a